Hi there. This is part two of the textures and composition project for Art 120 illustration. So today we're going to be working in Illustrator and applying some textures in Illustrator similar to how we did in Photoshop, but dealing with vector artwork instead of rasterized artwork, which is the difference between Illustrator and Photoshop. Um, so if you're unfamiliar with that, you can look into it a little bit more, but essentially in Photoshop, just like a regular photo, things are pixelized. They're using pixels to create the image that we're seeing. And you can only go so big with something that is pixelized before it starts to look distorted. You probably know this from looking at photos online. If you try to stretch it and get too big, it starts to look fuzzy and unclear. Where in Illustrator, we're working with vector artwork, which always will keep the clean lines that you've created, and you can expand them and contract them in any sort of size. It could be as small as a penny or as large as the size of a side of a building, and it will hold on to that clean aesthetic that it has without looking pixelized at all. So today we're going to look at working with a different composition that you've created. Your second composition, we worked with the first one in Photoshop. So what I'd like for you to do is repeat the steps for your second composition in Photoshop, adjusting the levels and saving that out as a PSD file so that you have a nice white background and some nice dark lines for your artwork. What we're looking for is contrast in there. You want the lines to be very dark and the paper to be very white. So if you need to refer back to the previous videos on how to do that, you can do so. But at this point, we're going to go ahead and open up our second file that I've already created. I'm actually going to be working off of the same file, but we're going to open this one up in Illustrator and we'll take it from there. So the first thing I want to do is open up Illustrator. And I provided you with these textures on Edmodo that I want you to download that we're going to use for today's practice. You can find a lot of free textures online, and these are going to be just a small example of what we're going to use for today's practice. But these are vectorized textures that were free, and we can utilize those for our artwork today. So within Illustrator, let's go ahead and open up your textures if you haven't already, so you have that pulled up. Download that from Edmodo and open it up. And then we're also going to open up our composition Photoshop file that we've already adjusted the levels on. So I'm going to go to File, Open, and find that composition artwork that I've already adjusted in Photoshop and open it up here in Illustrator. And it's going to give you a Photoshop import option, something like this. For this particular practice, we're just going to go to flatten layers to a single image to keep it nice and small. And I'm going to hit Command 0 here to see my full page. You should see something like this. So very similar to what we saw in Photoshop. It's still pixelized, right? So if we zoom in really close, we can see that these pixels are just what's creating this image. So if we were to scale this up very large, we would see some of this pixelization that's happening within this artwork. So the goal today is to create vectorized artwork out of this. So there's several ways to go about this. Obviously, you could use the pen tool to trace out these different shapes, which a lot of times is going to be what you're going to do. It's going to give you a much cleaner look. It's going to give you much fewer anchor points and make your file smaller and also the artwork just cleaner. But you can also do image trace options, and I don't encourage you to do this all the time by any means, but image trace can be a helpful tool, especially when we're dealing with illustrations or inkings that we're bringing into Illustrator. What we're looking for here is, again, some nice contrast, some nice thick lines to our artwork, and we want things to be closed off. So in this particular case, all of my shapes are closed off. There's no gaps in any of my shapes. So if that's the case, it'd be helpful to fix that in Photoshop with your brush tool and then bring it back into Illustrator so that all of your shapes are closed off so that this will work properly. So the first thing that we need to do is use our arrow tool to select the artwork. And we're going to actually go ahead and come up here to the very top and go to Image Trace. and it's going to tell us that it's going to go slowly. That's fine. We're going to click OK. Excuse me, I'm still sick, guys, working through this. So it's gone ahead and given us a default here, a default image trace. So it's already vectorizing this artwork for us. We can see if we zoom in now, we've lost all that pixelization. It's created vector artwork. And the cleaner your artwork is, the better that vectorization is going to work for this. The thicker the lines, the more contrast you have, it's going to work much better. So, but for this particular practice, we're actually going to adjust this a little bit further. So if you're not seeing the dialog box to adjust this further, if you come up to the top bar, you'll see image trace panel is up here. So I'm going to go ahead and click on that, and it should bring up my image trace options. I believe you can also find that in window image trace if you need to bring that up a different way. So within this dialog box here, we have some additional choices that we can sort of adjust to our live trace here. So threshold is going to be how much of that black that it actually picks up. Paths is going to be how closely it follows the actual paths that are called out. Corners is going to be how sharp the corners are, more or less, and actual noise within the illustration as well. So let's go ahead and let's maybe bump up our threshold ever so slightly. And every time we do this, it's going to kind of change the progress here as long as we have the preview toggled on. And I'm going to actually bring up my paths to about 80% as well. And then I'm going to bring down my corners to maybe 4%. I like to have smoother corners on mine. And then for my noise, I'm actually going to bring that down a little bit as well, maybe 5 or 6 pixels. So you should have something like this now. Things are a little bit tighter. There's hopefully not quite as many anchor points. Things are pretty smooth and following the lines that you want to follow. So that's looking pretty good. We want to make sure that the mode is in black and white. That should be the default, so we shouldn't have to worry about that. And then you can also ignore the white and just have the black lines if you toggle off this ignore white option here, which can be helpful at times as well. But for today's practice, we're actually going to keep the white shapes within those because we're going to change the colors. So once we're happy with this, we can come back up here and click the expand button. And as we can see, I'm going to go ahead and close my image trace window. It's gone ahead and expanded this. And now instead of being pixelized artwork, this is actually vectorized artwork with several different anchor points. We can always use our direct selection arrow if we needed to change any of those anchor points accordingly. We have not only the black lines, but we also have the individual lines, shapes within these are still called out as white. So right now, if I'm using my selection arrow and I click on here, it's going to select the whole thing because it's grouped together. So we can actually come up here to Object, Ungroup, and hopefully start to break apart some of these shapes a little bit differently. So now that we've ungrouped this whole deal, we can actually change the colors of these independent shapes, very similar to how we did in Photoshop. But you'll probably notice if you select on this that it's still in a grayscale here. If you open up your colors palette, each one of these individual shapes is still in grayscale. It's only white and black right now. So you can click on the top right up here and adjust that to CMYK and use the sliders to choose any color that you would like for these individual shapes. And we can also use the Pantone color system to start assigning these shapes. Now, your Pantone color system is going to be what we use here in the industry to create a universal color matching system. And it's used to create color consistency across a wide variety of platforms, materials, and uses. So PMS stands for Pantone Matching System. And really what it is it's a way for me to assign some colors to some sort of artwork and for the printers to have some sort of standardized way to match that color appropriately. So if I come over here to my actual artwork, I can go into, I'm going to go ahead and close this right now. If I come back into my swatches palette and I come up to my top right option, so if you're not seeing your swatches, make sure that your swatches are open in your window. If I come up here to the little hamburger up at the top right, you'll see if I slide down to Open Swatch Library, I can come over to Color Books, excuse me, And then I have several Pantone color books that I can refer to. One of the most common ones is solid coated, meaning that it has a solid color and it's some sort of coated paper. The second most common is probably uncoated paper. But let's go ahead and stick with solid coated for right now. So again, that's found under your swatches, open swatch library, color books, and Pantone solid color coated. So I'm going to go ahead and again open up this window that I already had here, and you can see here that it has a wide variety of colors for me to choose from, different hues and values of those hues. And again, each one of these colors is very specific to the Pantone matching system, and if I designate one of these shapes to be a specific PMS color, if I open back up my color up here, I can see that this specific Pantone color is Pantone 7712. So I could assign this color to this particular shape, send it off to the printers, and they could match this color exactly to produce that same color by matching the inks appropriately. So essentially you're going to go through and you can either convert each one of these colors by clicking them, going up here to CMYK and adjusting the slider, or you can come down to the PMS colors and assign them some sort of specific color that way as well. So you're going to go through and start assigning colors to each one of these shapes. And then in part 2 of the videos, we're going to start applying some textures within here as well. So this is the second part of the composition and textures within Illustrator for Art 120 illustration. So at this point, if you've already followed along with part 1, you should have something like this within Illustrator here. We've image traced the elements, we've opened up our Pantone color system, and we have assigned some sort of, or we've ungrouped it and then assigned some sort of colors to the individual shapes within our composition, very similar to how we did in Photoshop. So now we want to come in and start applying some textures to these individual shapes as well. So for this part, I want you guys to download the textures file that I've included in Edmodo. It's from RedPeg, and again, these are free textures that you can find online. You can also create your own, but we'll be looking at that a little bit later as well. But it's a great resource to be able to pull some textures that you can apply towards some of your designs as well. So we have several different textures that are already vectorized here for us. We can just click into these and copy them and paste them into our artwork. So I'm going to go ahead and work with this bottom right one here. I'm going to go Command-C to copy, and I'm going to go back to my composition, and I'm going to go Command-V or paste into my artwork here. Now it's a little bit small, so I'm going to go ahead and expand this. I'm going to grab a corner, and as long as I hold Shift, it should constrain those proportions. And if I hold Shift and Option at the same time, it actually pulls from the center versus one of the sides, which I find kind of helpful. So something like that seems to be working pretty well. I'm going to go ahead and shift it to kind of fit my artwork a little bit better. And I'm going to go ahead and apply this to this shape right here. So just by laying it in there, right now the color of this texture is white. Again, I could go in and designate any color for this particular vectorized texture, and it would reflect that. But for this particular practice, we're going to go ahead and just keep that white to see how that looks. So as you can see, the texture is applied to this shape, but it's also spilling out into these other shapes. So we're going to use a clipping mask similar to how we did in Photoshop, but it's just done a little differently here in Illustrator. So if we have that in place, I'm going to bring that down just a little bit in size so it kind of fills that space a little bit more. I like the size of that right now. I'm going to go ahead and just move this texture out of the way for right now. And I'm going to copy this texture first. So I'm going to select the texture, go to Edit, Copy. And I'm going to go ahead and select the shape that I want that texture to go into. Now, the clipping mask is done a little differently here in Illustrator. So in Illustrator, we're actually going to use our transparency option to apply this clipping mask. So if you don't see your transparency up, you can go ahead and go to Window and Transparency. And you should see something like this here for your transparency box to be able to start adjusting that. So within this transparency box, you'll see a button that says Make Mask. And there's a couple different steps to create this clipping mask here. So the first thing we're going to do is click Make Mask. And what that's done is it's created a complete mask of black for this, essentially blocking out this entire shape. So we're actually going to uncheck this clip right here. That should bring back our color. And then we're also going to click on the invert mask. So it's important to click Make Mask, then unclick the clip and click on the invert mask. A little tongue twister there. So now what we have is very similar to Photoshop. We have our actual shape and then we have our clipping mask right next to it. And you guys are familiar with the lock between the two and the two different thumbnails as well. So to apply that texture that we've already copied into this particular shape, we actually want to be selected on the thumbnail of the clipping mask, not of the shape. So you want to make sure that the thumbnail of the clipping mask is highlighted here. And we can actually just go Command V or paste and position the texture within that part of the shape again that we want it to be. And if we click outside of that, you'll see now that this texture is only within that shape. It's not actually going within the other shapes, which is exactly what we wanted. We just wanted it to stay within that shape. The other thing that you might notice is if you drag over this, right now this all of this artwork is on white, so it's hard to tell, but if we click back into the artwork thumbnail of the clipping mask, we can actually bring this whole shape over the gray. And what we'll notice is it's not just that this texture is white, it's actually, this texture is actually knocked out of this shape now. If I bring this shape to the front, we can see that I'm able to see through this shape to everything behind it. So we've actually used that texture as a sort of poking holes through this shape to be able to see through the rest. So that can be really helpful if you're doing some sort of distressing to some sort of t-shirt design or some sort of artwork that you then want to apply over an additional color or additional layer and have that see through. So anytime we want to adjust that, we can just click back into the clipping mask and adjust that texture within this. And I want to do one other thing here within this clipping mask before we exit this. If I go back to my textures, I'm going to go ahead and just click on another texture here to bring in. So I'm going to go up to Edit, Copy, or Command C, go back to my composition, and as long as, again, I'm clicked within the clipping mask, I shouldn't be able to click anything else outside of that clipping mask. I can go ahead and Command V or paste this new texture within here. And again, I'm going to hold my Shift and Option to expand that to make it a little bit larger to fit within here. And we should have a very similar look here. It's sort of taking away any color that's within that shape. But what we're going to do a little differently here is we're actually going to change the color of this and see how it affects this texture as well. So if we click on the color picker over here, you can see that right now this is white and that's allowing us to see through. Now if we go all the way down to black and click OK, you'll notice that we don't actually see any of the texture because it's not hiding anything. It's essentially saying, since it's black, it's not going to hide anything. White is going to be what hides the color. Black is going to be what reveals it, essentially. So what we can actually do is, instead of making it pure black, we can maybe make it some sort of grayscale and see how that changes, just to knock out somewhat of the color, but not everything. So I'm going to go up to, in my color picker here, I'm going to go ahead and slide down to somewhat of a darker gray, but not totally black or totally white. And what we'll see now if I click outside is that it didn't omit all of it, but it omitted some of that. So it just kind of adds a nice little layer of texture, some sort of distressing on top of what's already totally gone. It's kind of added in this distressing that is partially gone as well. So it's nice to sort of layer those and see how they're affected a little bit differently. And if we wanted to erase the other one, we could just be left with something a little bit more subtle there as well. But I'm going to kind of keep both of these in to work together for this particular one. Excuse me. So we've applied two different textures into this particular shape using the clipping mask. I'm going to go ahead and click back into the thumbnail of my artwork so that I can make additional adjustments into additional shapes here. So the next thing that I want to show you guys is how to create your own textures very simply as well. And one way that we can do that is by using the brush tool. So if we click over here on our tool panel and bring up our brush tool, we can actually then bring up the window for our brushes here. And within that window, I already actually have it pulled up here, artistic brushes, but I'm going to go ahead and close that and go back over to my brushes palette. I can actually, within my brushes palette here, I can click on my little hamburger and go up to Open Brush Library, very similar to how we did with the swatches to find the Pantones. And I'm going to go to Artistic maybe, and let's go to Artistic Paintbrush. And what that should do is bring up several different paintbrushes for us to use here. So for this one, I want to make my fill be none, and I want my stroke to be white for this one. Let's see if I can, I'll just go ahead and click into my select color here and make that white. And I'm going to go ahead and just click on one of these brushes to start using, and I'm just going to make some kind of scratches here, almost like there's some sort of distressing that was going on with this texture with some sort of scratches. And I might pick another brush and just vary up how those look a little bit, create some that are bigger and some that are a little bit smaller, just creating a little bit diversity within these scratches, and maybe add one or two more, just kind of playing it up a little bit here. Yeah. So once you have something like that, you've just created a bunch of random marks with our brushes. We can actually turn this into a texture really easily. So in order to do so, we're going to go to our arrow tool, and we're just going to click and drag over all of these different brush marks that we've made. And now we're going to come up here to Object, Expand Appearance. And what that does is it's no longer creating those as strokes, as brushes. It's actually creating those as shapes now. So from here, we can start to apply this in the same way that we did. So we can just copy that. We can come over to another one of our shapes and select one of our shapes by going into our transparency panel right here. We can again go to Make Mask, unclick the clip, and click on the invert mask. And now it's important that we paste into the appropriate thumbnail here. Right now the default is selected onto the thumbnail of the artwork, but we actually want to be in the thumbnail of the clipping mask. And you shouldn't be able to click anything else when you're inside that clipping mask of this shape. But since we've already copied that, we're selected into the clipping mask, we can just hit Command V or paste. And again, you'll start to see how we can now apply this within this particular shape here. And by utilizing this custom sort of texture that we've made, we're able to kind of fit it within this shape. I might, and we can distort this because there's no real proportions that I'm trying to stick to for this particular one. I might elongate it a little bit to kind of stretch. I can get it into position how I want it. And I'm going to go ahead and click outside of that and see how I like that. And that looks pretty good. And as long as I click back in my artwork now, I can make any other adjustments that I need to within my artwork. So what I'm encouraging you guys to do is play with some of the textures that are available within our textures here, within the particular shapes after we've assigned colors. And I also want you to use your brushes to maybe experiment with making some of your own sort of marks. Again, selecting all of those, going up to Object, Expand, and then using those as a texture within the artwork as well. So as always, if you have any questions, feel free to contact me via email, or I'll be in the classroom walking you guys through this as well. Hey all, I apologize. I forgot to include the option for the clipping mask within the instructions for this, so I just wanted to go ahead and add this in as well. So another option for this is creating a clipping mask for this. So instead of having the option of the shape be knocked out so that you can see through it, we can also just either with one of these additional textures or with some marks that we've made on our own, we can also just add a specific color to one of these items. Let's go ahead and grab one of these textures over here as well. I'm going to copy that, come back over to my composition and edit paste, Command V. And I'm just going to go ahead and make this texture the same color that I have here of my marks. So the other option is simply creating a clipping mask for these different textures within these particular shapes as well. So this would give you the ability to change the color of these so that it's not necessarily seeing through the shape, but you're applying an additional color to these as well. So let's say we wanted to have something like these markings going on, this sort of harsh texture in this shape, but we only want it to fit within this yellow shape that we have here. So the first thing that we'd want to do would be to select the different objects that we have. So we have these marks here as well as this texture that we've brought in. So we want to select both of those together by holding the Shift button down. You can click on the first shape right here, and then by holding Shift, select on the second texture behind it. And we want to go up to Object and Group. So it's really important that we group all of the textures that we want to live within the clipping mask before we apply that actual clipping mask. And the next thing we want to do is copy this shape in the background here. I'm going to zoom in so that I can click on that actual shape. And we're going to want to pull that in front of those textures to apply the clipping mask. So once I have that shape selected, I can go up to Edit, Copy, and Edit, Paste in Front. Now, ideally that pasted in front of all these textures, but we can actually tell that it hasn't. It's pasted in front of that other shape, but not actually in front of the textures because we can still see them. So we want to actually go up to Object, Arrange, Bring to Front to make sure that that shape, which we can see now, is in front of our textures. So once we have that shape in front of the textures that we want to live in this clipping mask, we already have the shape selected. I can just hold the Shift button to select the grouping of the textures behind it. And then all we have to do is go up to Object, Clipping Mask, and Make. And the shortcut for that is Command 7 as well. And once we do that, you'll see that now the particular textures that we've called out are actually only within this particular shape. We've created a clipping mask for that particular shape, just like we did in Photoshop as well. So you can always go in and double click into this clipping mask. You'll notice as soon as I double click in, it starts to enter into the clipping group here. So this is the entire group or the entire shape. If you wanted to, let's say we wanted to change the color to that to be something different. Let's go with an orange here. And then on top of that, you can actually double click into the particular group as well. So we have two textures within this group. We have this texture here and this texture here. So if you wanted to change one of those colors even ever so slightly as well, you could do that as well. And you can tell that we've not only entered the clipping group, but we've actually entered the group as well. And we can either double click out of that, or we can just hit the back button here in order to exit out of that clipping mask. And now you can see that I've changed the individual textures within that clipping mask as well by double clicking into that. So I just wanted to share that with you. That's applying a clipping mask to these textures, which again is not going to necessarily knock the texture out. It's actually creating a texture on top of the existing color, different from the previous one we were doing, which was creating a texture that was making that shape transparent, like we can see here. So we still have our original color here, and then our clipping mask, which is following that shape to go over that. So if you have any questions, please shoot me an email, and please refer to the other two videos as well for this particular practice. Thank you.